guys. Welcome to episode 2 of Before the Whistle. Before I get started, I just wanted to pause and take a moment to thank everyone who listened, everyone who gave such overwhelming feedback to what was really a personal moment for me, opening up kind of and being vulnerable about my journey into this industry and really my journey through life. It was somewhat of a risk identifying what my weak points are, what my pain points are, and my struggles when I'm trying to kind of pitch a show to you as viewers. But I think that really touched on exactly what I want to do with this show, which is bring that humanistic aspect to this very violent sport that we oftentimes forget is really not a sport played by players. It's human beings doing something together. And that means working together, being coached by another human being, communicating with other human beings. And that has to do, in my opinion, more with psychology than it does with sports. So that brings me to my topic for today's episode, which is an interview with Mike Clark, who is the director of clinical and sports psychology at the University of Arizona. When I had started doing the Sports Hangover and coming in to co-host with Gus back in 2021, I started scheduling some guests of my own prior to hosting that 3-hour show, and several thereafter by myself. Because Gus wanted me to get that experience of finding and identifying guests that touched on things I found important and wanted to talk about, and getting used to getting them on the show. And so one of my earlier guests was Dr. Scott Goldman, who was one of the co-creators of the AIQ, which is the Athletic Intelligence Quotient. We had connected. He was actually a Tulane alumni, and I remember wondering how a guy from Albuquerque, New Mexico kind of ended up at Tulane. We just got to talking, and I remember something he had brought up about this IQ test that he had developed, where he talked about taking, I believe it was the Wonderlic or just a general IQ test, and it had asked something about what a schooner is, or schooner. I can't even think of the word because I also don't know it. Apparently it's a term for a boat, but that was geographically specific to a region that didn't include New Mexico. And that's kind of the issue with IQ tests and these assessments, and a lot of them in general. It's very similar to the SAT and the ACT, where things like race, education level, culture, and socioeconomic status matter more than someone's natural abilities. And what had stuck out to me about the AIQ was it controlled for all of those factors. It's used by the NFL, the NCAA, the MLB, the NBA, I believe the NHL, and the Olympics. And I recall Dr. Goldman telling me that the MLB specifically really credited it with being able to identify players from South America who score really well on this cognitive assessment, but they wouldn't be able to do well on something like the Wonderlic because they don't speak English. But as someone that speaks English and actually tried taking the Wonderlic very briefly yesterday, I gave up after about 7 questions because it was too much for me. And I consider myself to be a fairly intelligent person, but I think how we define intelligence, the definition of intelligence on a basic level is the ability to learn or understand or to deal with new or trying situations, also known as a skilled use of reason, or the ability to apply knowledge, to manipulate one's environment, or to think abstractly as measured by objective criteria. And that objective criteria is kind of where the problem lies. Sure, it's objective, but is it objective in the sense that every person's given a fair opportunity to succeed and define their intelligence on a typical IQ test? Well, the answer is no, but the AIQ is different. It accounts for equity in intelligence. It identifies how a player is smart and how a player struggles and how to kind of account for those things. And it's not just book smarts. And there's been some talk about this S2 cognition test coming out, and all these scores related to quarterbacks. And I think there are a ton of assessments out there that identify key components of an athlete's intelligence, specifically where they thrive and where they struggle. But as someone that came from a psychology background, reading up on the AIQ and the intelligence theories behind it, which I asked Mike about in our interview, and he will probably explain it better than I will. But, there's this theory of the difference between something called fluid and crystallized intelligence. And so crystallized intelligence is information you've accumulated. Can you retain it and spit it out? Whereas fluid is more learning things on the fly and adapting and applying them to immediate situations. So I think that it offers a really holistic look at how we define intelligence, but also what sports psychology really means. It's not just a hoopla term, and it's not this kind of psychology wumbo jumbo. A lot of psychology is the things like the theory of learning, the theory of memory retention. And without further ado, I think you guys will really enjoy this conversation. I think Mike really humanizes again and bridges that gap of the science and the psychology behind things, and really how it all has everything to just do with who we are as human beings. All right, I'm joined now by Mike Clark, who is the director of sports psychology at University of Arizona. Welcome, Mike. And if you could just kind of tell listeners what you do and your background in this industry.
Yeah, no, Maddy, thanks for having me. You said it best. Clinical and sports psychology, that's kind of the world I live in. So really just helping a lot of high performers, mostly in sport, but in some other domains as well, just figure out ways to improve. Sometimes those are measures of mental health. Sometimes they're mental performance. Sometimes it's anywhere in between, decision-making, stuff like that. So really feel fortunate to be in the position I am and really love the work.
And I think sports psychology is such a big umbrella term that people really don't have a great grasp of. And you bring up things like mental health struggles, which are differentiated from that. But bringing up things like reaction time, is that something that kind of falls under sports psychology? And how would you kind of define that term in the most simple way possible?
Sure. Yeah, and you're right. It's a massive umbrella term when we talk about sports psychology, and when we specifically talk about things like reaction time, uh, it's a trainable skill. So unlike a reflex, think you go to the doctor, they have a little puff of air in your eye, and you blink. That's just a reflex. You can't really change that much. Reaction time is a skill that can be trained and changed. And when we can measure it, we can get baseline measures of it. So it's really just your response to something that happens, I guess, would be how I would define it in a colloquial way. But I'm sure if I looked in a dictionary, it would maybe sound a little better than that.
Like, that's not going for the dictionary terms here, but you segued well into my next point. You saying, being able to assess this. So, I had talked with Scott Goldman, who is the creator of the Athlete Intelligence Quotient, actually connected because he's a Tulane alumni, and was wondering how he got there from New Mexico. But I talked to him on a radio show 2 years ago now, and with the draft happening, it kind of puts this stuff all in the forefront. So the AIQ, in its most basic terms, what is that test and how does it measure things that matter in these athletes?
Yeah. So the AIQ in many ways, it was groundbreaking and still really helpful because, what does it do? Well, it tests the cognitive abilities of an athlete and measures their intelligence. And this is important because, spoken to in a really basic way, it helps us understand how athletes make decisions, how they take in information, whether it's immediate or in a more broad sense, how they react to things, kind of like your intro question, and how efficiently they learn. And if we just break it up even into those broad categories, I think it's understandable to know why we accept that and why coaches and athletes and other stakeholders are interested. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the AIQ in a not even in a nutshell, but as we maybe intro how it can be helpful, it helps us and other people understand strengths that athletes have, and also maybe areas for growth. So I'll pause there because there's a lot there.
Yeah, and I think, when we hear about intelligence IQ tests, we all think of ones we might have taken online or something where it's all these kind of things. And what stuck out to me about the AIQ is that, it was kind of developed out of the inequity of tests like the Wonderlic, which just measure basic intelligence. I actually started taking the sample Wonderlic yesterday, and I had to stop because I can't do mental math. That doesn't mean that I'm not intelligent in other areas. And the AIQ, is based off of an intelligence theory. It's called the CHC model, but you gave me the term earlier, and I'll let you kind of talk about it. But if you could just kind of explain what that theory is and how Dr. Goldman really created this test through that theory of how we look at intelligence in human beings.
Yeah. So there are a few different ways to look at intelligence. There are a few different ways to measure intelligence. The CHC model, or the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence, starts from a very broad or general way of looking at intelligence. This is what would be referred to as like a G factor. So just like overall, what's your IQ score? And so whether it's in the AIQ athletic intelligence or just intelligence for anyone in the general population, CHC would suggest, okay, we're going to start with general abilities. From there, we're going to get a little bit more honed into some broad terms. So things like fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, memory, and processing speed are kind of those big buckets. Also things that the AIQ are based off of. An example being, crystallized intelligence is more like fact-based things like, do you know the rule? Almost demeaning to say like, do you know that like there are 4 downs that you have an opportunity to advance the ball? Like obviously every guy in the field and everyone watching that knows that, but that would be more crystallized versus fluid would be taking in new information and problem solving on the go. So those are like those broad categories that CHC looks at. And then finally, it just narrows down into very narrow subtests. And so, can you break down memory into short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory? Can you break down processing speed into more immediate processing without challenges versus when you are distracted and there are challenges that you're facing? So really the theory is deep, and I think I'm scratching the surface with explaining it, but for the sake of this conversation, that's I think really how Scott, what he saw and how he based the AIQ off something that's really rich in psychological theory.
Yeah, and you bring up things like short-term memory and long-term working, which I think everyone can kind of understand. And as someone that had a concussion, I have a very poor working memory now. So that's a struggle when I'm on the sideline. I'm trying to remember what I was just about to say in a report, but my long-term one is still very intact. So as long as it's crystallized, which like you said, is kind of that accumulated knowledge, then that's easier for me to kind of work through. But that theory, I was reading up on it, and there's something like 11 or 10 different areas, but through kind of the testing and the development of the AIQ, I know that they identified these 4 important areas, and then kind of those subsets underneath each one of them, those being visual processing, learning efficiency, which you brought up, reaction time and processing speed. But through all the hoopla, what in, again, layman's terms, does something like learning efficiency mean in a football situation, and things like reaction time and the differentiation between their umbrella terms of simple and choice reaction time.
Right. And so specific to learning efficiency, it's broken down into a couple different ways. So, can we store and recall information through association? So like when we see a sign on the sideline, do we know what that means? So that's more like, are we able to learn what that means and then recall it and do something with it? And then really how quickly and accurate are we doing that, and how many mistakes are we making? Why this is important is because, especially the NFL, you have depth in every position, and yet every guy gets there with a different skill set, so to speak, a different mental skill set. Some are quick learners and they're sharp and they're able to recall, and we should know that. Just like the guy ahead or below him on the depth chart may take a little bit longer to learn something, but from a physical standpoint, he can do it all just the same. So to get really specific in an example, and one that I really like, is that when we know how efficiently a guy can learn, it can help a coach or really anyone who's working with him to change their delivery in a more effective way. If he's a fast learner and he's not getting it the first time, maybe it's one other pivot and you let him work through it himself. A guy like that, if you load on, 8, 9, 12 different critiques, you might just be creating a dynamic that's going to create frustration in your coaching relationship with him. Versus if you know that a guy is going to take a little bit longer to learn, you can pivot in your approach there and really meet him where he's at.
It's interesting because I've been taking the Scouting Academy course, which is learning, how to scout each position. And they don't give you the Aaron Donalds because that's, it's easy. It's like agreeing with an essay topic, but, they kind of give you those more in the middle players where you have to kind of, what do they do well versus what, can't they do? But when I'm looking at what they can't do a lot of the time, I do find myself wondering, is this something that is impossible for them to learn? Or, like you said, is it something that they're having difficulty with a certain type of blocking scheme because the way their coaches have taught it to them isn't the way that they, retain and learn that? And so I think this can really kind of complement that traditional scouting. But do you ever kind of run into that with coaches where perhaps they have to kind of take a step back and look at their own biases and how they think they might be communicating best? And is that ever kind of a challenge in having them take a step back and realize that they might not be communicating to a player best? And how do you kind of help them figure out how to do so?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's a fine line. I mean, we're coming at this conversation from a pure learning and IQ standpoint, which it could be happening at any given time, but it doesn't negate personality, character, even mental health concerns that could be the kind of the screen for how an athlete is communicating to a coach. So it can be a fine line between a coach absolutely doing what they've known to work for 10 years, and it'll probably work with the guy that they're coaching, and maybe it's on the athlete to be more open and coachable. I will put an asterisk there. But yeah, there are definitely times when a coach is doing everything that they know how to do. The athlete's working their hardest, and there's that pain point of, like, I don't know what to do with this guy. I don't think he's lazy or being defiant, and I don't think he's unable to learn. But the coach is also saying, but I don't really know what to do, and I don't want to just trade or cut the guy. He's important to our organization, or whatever it might be. So there are definitely those pain points, and I don't know that there's one quick answer for that, but I think that in this case, having more information about how someone takes on information can inform that coach, because the coaching is teaching, and they know how to teach inherently, and maybe they just need to know, what the athlete is thinking or not thinking.
Yeah, and I also feel like if you've gotten to the point where you've administered the AIQ, you probably are looking at, a pretty open-minded coach that's
Yeah.
willing to kind of look at these things. And I know that you mentioned when we had previously talked that you sometimes have the coaches take it themselves, and you brought up a really interesting story about a female coach that you had. If you wouldn't just kind of mind going back through that story and what you really took away from the insight of having her take that test and how that happened with all of the players in her group.
Yeah, no, and I love when coaches are open to taking it themselves, and it's the exact same test that the athletes would take, and so it gives us the breakdown of data in the exact same way. And of course, the coach gets their test results back so they can see. And in this particular instance, the coach has one of the higher AIQ scores that maybe I've ever seen. Very high, and actually superior in 3 of the 4 big buckets, so to speak. And her relative weakness is still high average. And this is compared to the professional and college athlete population. She herself was a professional athlete previously. And so it was great to know, because she's a very quick learner. She is able to take in information in a broad sense and in a narrow sense. She's able to work through the puzzle pieces in her mind, and she has a fast processing speed. Very said bluntly, like, her computer is incredible in her head.
Yeah.
and what we found was that the group of athletes she was coaching, her specific group, also had very, very high scores in many of the same domains. And so it was interesting when her and I sat down and we looked at her data, and then we looked at her team or her group's data, and we're like, there's like almost a bunch of mini me's in here. Okay, so how do you want to be talked to if you're in that situation, or you're frustrated and you're going through a slump, or whatever it might be? And it was a really nice point of reflection, because there was objective data to show that who she was coaching also were quick learners. And so the pivot was, hey, put it on them a little bit. They're hungry for this and they're capable of doing this. It might actually be less coaching and more time that they need to just struggle on their own. And it was a really nice moment. I think she felt validated. I think the athletes got something out of it. And really, I didn't even ask her to take the test. She was saying, hey, if my athletes are going to do it, I want to take it too. I said, fine. So it was a really nice thing that came out of that.
Yeah, because I think especially if you are trying to understand how players learn, identifying what your own strengths and weaknesses are, I think can be really valuable because,
Mm-hmm.
if you're not as proficient in an area as everyone else, then you might have to kind of rechange your strategy. But at the same time, if your memory and retention is so much greater than your players, knowing that I think helps rather than, like you said, keep trying to do the same thing and it's just really not working. But we've kind of talked about learning efficiency, retention, and everything, but this is such a complex test, and there's a lot of tests out there nowadays, but this one seems like it really has value at every type of position. And I was kind of reading, how it can predict, for example, how edge rushers in specific categories, if they have high scores there, they are probably going to have more sacks, more tackles for losses, and less pre-snap penalties. What kind of factors within that test would indicate that, about an edge rusher, and why specific to them?
Sure, and great question. So when I think first off, I think about reaction time. And so if a guy like that has high reaction time and he knows that, he can trust himself that he's not going to be jumping off sides and that, he's going to be able to respond or react in a way that's helpful. So already there, we're gonna pull that out. Another thing is really spatial awareness. And so one of the kind of sub ways that we look at this is either spatial awareness, so the ability to like look at things in space, move around them the most efficiently, but also something called navigation, which is kind of what it sounds like. How do we move from point A to point B in the fastest way? And, in football, we would love it if that was a straight line. But except for the instances when there's a massive blindside sack that everyone loves, which is probably more rare than it is common, that navigation isn't from A to B. And so, when someone has a strength in this, they're able to recognize where objects are in space, how to move around them. And that's really important for an edge rusher. So when I think about even just these things put together, learning efficiency or not, like whether it took them forever to learn how to do it or in an instance, things like that are really, really prevalent on the test, and they end up shining really, really bright in positions like that.
And I think we all kind of understand the term spatial awareness and navigation, but I obviously, if you have a good score in both of those categories, and that's more optimal. But suppose someone had a poor spatial awareness but good navigation score, or vice versa. What does that kind of look like? Like, how do differentiate what that would kind of look like and what an athlete is able to see and do?
Yeah. So in like with an edge rusher, if he had good navigation but poor spatial awareness, I would be a little surprised, to be honest. But of course, I'm sure in our data set there's examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would think, and it's a great question. I point that out because it's putting me on the spot a little bit here. If he's able to know how to get from point A to point B in the most efficient and effective manner, he's going to want to try what he's probably done in the past. If he has average to low average or maybe poor spatial awareness, he may not realize that while there's green grass 6 yards ahead of him, there may be someone just at his 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock who's going to maybe get a cheap little blow on him that might put him off axis and get in the way of how he gets from his position to the quarterback. And the other way would be someone being very like high spatial awareness, low navigation. His ability to really recognize like, oh, here are all of the things that are in my way, but I really don't know how to get there the fastest way. And that probably happens more often than not. And what covers up something like this is
Mhm.
just raw physical ability. I have seen scores with guys who really indicate that they should not be able to get from point A to point B. But then you look at their 40 or you watch them on
Mhm.
Sunday, and he's just a dude and he's outworking the other guy. And that's just the difference maker. And really, I love getting nitty gritty with the psych data and everything like this, but we can't negate the physical, the technical, the tactical, because it all works as one at any given moment.
No, 100%. You know, I had brought up before we started recording, you know, asking kind of if learning disabilities like ADHD
Mhm.
can be identified here. But in that same note, you know, if some guy is really, like you said, just a physical specimen, and especially if he just dominates in college at edge rusher, even if he gets to the NFL and does well, his brain circuits and what he's having to do to overcome perhaps his poor navigation because he's relying on his natural physical traits, it's just so mentally exhausting. And I don't think people always realize that. And so I think this test really helps separate what a player's weak spots are. So instead of trying to course correct on a bunch of things that might not be necessary, something as simple as, and is there some way to train those types of things? Like, and it might not be the case for all of these, but something like navigation, is that something that you, are there things that you guys implement to help someone improve that, or do you just kind of coach with the awareness that they have that deficit?
Definitely yes, and if you have the data and you can coach with the knowledge of the deficit, I think that it helps you to improve, what you're doing on the field with these guys. And yet there are definitely things that we can do. I mean, all 10 subtests that give you data also have things that are all things that can be trained and influenced, which is cool. So specifically with navigation, I think it would start with film, because if a guy's in the league, he's watched however many thousands of hours of film, starting in high school or maybe before. So examples of what, and the more that you can use that specific player, the better, or someone that's really, really similar to him. That's just back in like good old Bandura social learning theory. Like, we attach to people who we think are more like us. And
Mhm.
so giving him film, first off, that is him doing the right thing and him doing the thing that you'd like to be changed. That's probably number one. That you're, hey, here, we're aware of the problem, here's what we're after. But the more that we can get it in a drill, first person perspective, through that guy's own eyes doing it differently, the better. And so there are, I mean, really, for any position, there are a number of drills that align with these subtests. And so at that point, whether it's navigation or reaction time or whatever, it's just that guy maybe getting some more reps or deeper quality of rep when he gets the opportunity.
What sticks out to me and is super interesting is there's these tangible examples you're able to point to in an exact football sense of here's what you could do to improve a player's performance. But you bring up a bunch of kind of intelligence theories and learning theories and things that are in the world of psychology are really an everyday thing, but they're so not discussed, I think, in the realm of sports. And so as much as we have these assessments and everything, seeing that you also, you know, work as the director of sports and clinical psychology at U of A, how important are the principles of psychology to the sport of football? And is it something that we're kind of missing the point on when it comes to learning things like, you know, it's not just mental health when we talk about psychology. It's like you said, it's learning theory, intelligence theory, social theories of, you know, mirroring behaviors of someone that is like you. How much is that really a point of what you do in your work at U of A?
Well, I think it's important, and it has its place in with some teams and in some rooms more than others, because
Mhm.
every coach, has their own philosophy and the things that have worked. And really my job is to work actually really for the athlete. I mean, the athlete is my client, so to speak. But coach consults are totally fair game and happen all the time, not disclosing protected health information, but but things like social learning or just learning in a very direct way happen all the time. And so, I think you're getting at the heart of it, in that I think a lot of people have grasped onto mental health lately because it's become in vogue and people have spoken about the importance of addressing mental health concerns and preventing major mental health concerns, which is all good and fine. But a lot of times it's hey, go see the therapist. I want you back in full health kind of approach, which is fine, but it's not getting at improving the specific ways they can learn or they can react in a different way. So it's interesting because learning, as soon as you bring up learning theories, everyone checks out. They're like, this is
Right.
dumb. Like, what? I'm not in school, I'm not in class, I don't want to listen to this. In fact, it was one of the more boring areas of my own training. Like, I didn't even really like it very much. But when I learned that coaching is really just teaching, and that was in my earliest days. Rick McGuire was my first sports psych advisor, and he was always saying, hey, you're a teacher. Okay, you're a teacher of these concepts, and you're here to help. You're not necessarily here to just tell people, but to help them learn. It clicked for me. And so I think the more I bring in concepts like that to coaches, it clicks. I'm like, you're already doing this stuff. Let's just put words on it and then be deliberate about understanding if it's working or if it's not working, and then what could we do to change. And the beautiful thing about my role at Arizona is that I mean, so many of our coaches, if not all of our coaches, truly are engaged in the process of improvement. And I don't have the answers all the time. And what's cool is that they're open to having a discussion, knowing that if I may not have the answer, I may ask a question that helps them to find the answer that they already knew they had. And to me, that's some really, really fulfilling work.
And I think that's important to point out about psychologists, because it might, seem like there's always the answer to something, but the human
Mhm.
mind is literally its own world, and there always isn't an answer. But I think, as people in psychology also are a little more aware of those kind of things like biases and recognizing your own limitations. But I think it is really important to talk about in the field of coaching, because like you said, it is just teaching. It's the same thing in terms of studying to become a clinical psychologist and learning how to apply these things. You're just learning, how to take these skills and apply them on a football field. But I think just changing the way that we look at these things, like, psychology assessments and the mental health difference between the psychological aspects of learning and things like that. With the AIQ and with your, work, is there anything that we kind of haven't touched on that you feel like is, one of the more rewarding or important parts of your job that, again, people might not know that well about sports psychologists?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's really just developing relationships with people and understanding pain points and helping them through them. And I think people realize that when they think of psychologists, but we really gloss over the relationship component. And to me, it is so fulfilling for someone to come in and say, and to bring in some vulnerability and say, hey, I don't know, I'm not feeling great about this. What do you think? And sometimes you have the answer and you need to help them guide toward the answer. And sometimes you don't, just like we've been talking about. But the fulfilling thing is, for me at least, to understand in confidence what they're dealing with, helping them shape something out to be more effective. And then when you see them actually go out and perform, whether it be in school or on the field, and do the thing that they want to do, the coolest thing is to know that maybe that guy was struggling to put his shoes on 2 weeks ago, and then for him to go and not make an error, or for him to even just show up and do the exact same thing he wanted to do, let alone the ESPN top 10 highlight reel thing. It's not always that. In most cases, it's not. It's realizing the struggle someone's gone through, the strength that they had to go through it, and then to see them back in full health and full functioning. To me, that is just the coolest thing, and that's what makes me show up every day and keeps me hopeful and engaged. And yeah, I don't know that it's something that people wouldn't know, but I think it's super real and can't be understated.
No, I think that was beautifully said. And again, kind of my whole point of this entire show is that it really is about human beings playing a sport, and it's not,
Mhm.
a sport played by players kind of thing. So I think that's really a perfect way to put it, and kind of, wrap this discussion all up. So if there's nothing that I haven't skipped over, again, thank you so much for your time, Mike. I would love to, follow up with you later on in the show, and kind of see how things develop, see if there are some players that go into the draft that do well or don't do well, and kind of looking back on what might have indicated that. But thank you so much for your time. And I think that this will offer, again, just that humanistic aspect that I think is missing all of the time in sports.
Yeah, no, this was awesome, and I appreciate you having me. I'll talk sports psych any day of the week. So hopefully, this resonated with someone out there. And again, thanks for having me.
So there you have it. That was an extremely fascinating conversation to have. And I really thank Mike again for his time. It's really my favorite part about this industry is connecting with like-minded people and being able to talk about things greater than sports, but also bringing things that I think are important things to talk about into the area of sports, and humanizing it. And I think Mike really illustrated quite well how the AIQ does that, but also just, his line of work. I think it's so much more than just this assessment. And you can look up, and I can provide those resources absolutely, and explain them more for people if they're interested, what exactly those things are, like choice reaction time versus distract reaction time. Now I'm having a simple reaction time. Those things are all important, but I think really the heart of what Mike was getting at was intelligence is not linear, and it's not a one size fits all thing. And someone can be really intelligent in one area and struggle in another area. But does that mean that we throw the whole player out? And I brought up, the scouting academy, and how, we look for what a player can and can't do. And for a scout, it's not really their job to implore, I wonder if they have issues with spatial processing. That's, but I think it can complement that. So if you see a player like that, in a perfect world, they have all taken the AIQ. And I think you would be able to look up and probably see a correlation with these things. But I just think it helps coaches identify those teaching points. As you said, if a player has poor spatial awareness, but good navigation, you don't have to keep teaching him the path to get to the quarterback. He could figure it out. What you need to teach him is how to be more aware of himself in space. I identified with that. I think I'm a pretty good navigator. I can get the heck out of a really crowded area very fast, but I have no spatial awareness. A lot of that is kind of an ADHD trait. I bump into people, I bump into things all the time. I just hit my knee in my bed earlier. I can navigate, but it's helpful to know and distinguish these things, and just reshape, I think, how we look at intelligence and sports psychology as a whole. Because when you look at something like the Wonderlic, I went to Tulane, and I graduated from there, and I have a master's degree, and I consider myself to be fairly intelligent, but I couldn't get through 6 of these questions because I can't do mental math. And again, for players in the MLB or in football who either come from, a South American country, don't speak English, or come from a background where they don't have all these resources to succeed, they're not probably going to perform well on the Wonderlic. And that's a disservice to those athletes, and who they are as people, and where their intelligence truly lies. So I think these kind of tests can really do a lot to just illuminate these things and change how we think about the idea of coaching. Is it's really more about teaching and learning. And that's something that I think we all can continue to evolve and work on, and look inward, investigate ourselves and our own biases. And I think the AIQ is something that allows coaching staffs to do just that, especially, as Mike said, if they take it themselves. So that's all from us on episode 2, Before the Whistle. The show format moving forward is going to look like this, with episodes coming out on Tuesdays and Fridays. The Friday episode, I'm going to shoot more often than not to have a guest on. And then Tuesdays, I'll just kind of rant and go on my rabbit holes by myself. And that'll change, as the season starts for both college and the pros, as rookie mini camp starts, training camp. But for now, that's really the basic format. And I'm really grateful for conversations I've already been able to have in just 1 week of this show. So again, you can find this on YouTube, which will be the video version. If you're more of an audio person, we are on Apple Podcasts. So just remember to Like and subscribe to me, guys. If you like my content, I would really appreciate it. And I'm really bad at promoting myself, but this is me trying to do my best. And I'm going to post all of those on my Twitter, which is Maddy Hudak _94. That's MADDY HUDAK, 94 being the year I was born in. That's the hub for all this stuff. You can find it on my Instagram too, which is just Maddy Hudak _. But again, Apple Podcasts and YouTube under Heart in the Paint Sports Media is where you'll find that. I can't thank you guys enough again for joining me in this new journey. And I hope today's episode helped us all learn something new about the game of football, but also about ourselves.